All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to talk about ecological tolerance today. So let's get to it. First of all, what is ecological tolerance? Well, it's the range of abiotic conditions that an organism can live in before they start getting sick and or dying. So here's an example right here. I have a fish tank in this diagram, and this long tube with some red in it is supposed to represent a thermometer. The lower the red is, the cooler the temperature. So this is a cold temperature. And this over here is a hot temperature. And so notice most of the fish are congregating in the middle of this tank where you would assume the temperature would be not too cold, not too hot. Notice there are very few in the cold end and very few in the hot end because the fish feel less comfortable there. Just like if you're like outside sweating and you get a chance to move into a cooler temperature, you do. Or if you're on one of the like freezing cold rooms in our building, when you get a chance, you move to a warmer temperature. There are certain ranges that organisms find comfortable. Now, temperature is a big example, but it's not the only thing. There are two things that are only going to apply in aquatic ecosystems. For example, salinity, which, if you remember, is the salt concentration in the liquid, and the flow rate. How fast is water flowing? This is going to be something you might see in oceans, especially tidal areas and rivers. Not so much in lakes or ponds, which are more still water. And then sunlight is also an issue, especially if you're talking about producers and plants because they need enough sunlight to photosynthesize. However, there is such a thing as too much sun. Too much sun can actually damage plant leaves. So this is a kind of typical graph that you would see, a very general one that's looking at the particular abiotic factor. So it could be temperature, could be salinity, etc. We can divide this. This is showing the population size, so how many organisms are living in each of these zones. You have what's called the optimal zone, and most of the organisms are going to live in this range because they're healthiest, they're most comfortable. Then you have what are called the stress zones, and the stress zones are going to have fewer organisms there because they're going to be less healthy, and they're going to be more likely to get sick and or die. Another thing is they're just going to get uncomfortable, so they're going to want to move to where they feel more comfortable. And finally, you have the zones of intolerance, and these are the areas that organisms will not tolerate easily. They're not going to want to live in this environment. So as soon as they can, they move out of these zones of intolerance because if they stay there for too long, they're very likely to die. Now, if we look at, say, the ecological tolerance of a species, and I'm not indicating a population of species because we're going to compare an individual organism to an entire species. So let's say we were able to graph the health of the organism. So in this example, the organisms would be most healthy around here, but they would have a fairly wide range. Well, they would have this wide a range of conditions under which they could comfortably live. And that includes their zone of stress and zone of intolerance, as well as the optimal conditions. Now, due to genetic variation, organisms can have different characteristics. So you might have a member of this species who actually has a wider zone of tolerance, a wider range of conditions under which it can live. Maybe this is a matter of temperature, and maybe this organism is able to withstand slightly lower, slightly higher temperatures, a wider range. This is a good thing when you have diversity and different genes in an ecosystem and different traits. That's good because if the conditions in this ecosystem change, this individual, and let's say they can withstand warmer temperatures, so their zone of intolerance might be like here. Intolerance. Whereas the zone of intolerance for the whole species is here, they're able to live in slightly warmer temperatures. So if the global temperature increases, these individuals would be able to survive and reproduce and hopefully carry on the species. Now, not only do we have differences in tolerances between individual organisms, but an organism's tolerance can actually change during its lifetime. So I don't know how much you guys know about salmon, but salmon are a little weird. Most fish tend to be either freshwater or saltwater. They either live in rivers and streams and lakes or they live in the ocean. Salmon do something weird. They are born in freshwater and rivers and streams. Once they end up growing up, they're going to migrate to the ocean and live in salt water. And then, after they're ready to reproduce, when they become sexually mature, they are going to move back to the freshwater streams, usually the ones they were born in, to reproduce. So, when they are young, when they are juveniles, they will have a very low tolerance for salinity, meaning they will be more healthy and comfortable in lower salt concentrations, which makes sense because over here is fresh water. So if you took a baby salmon, I believe they're called fry, and you randomly stuck it in some salt water, you would kill it because that's in its range of intolerance. On the other hand, once they mature, they move to the ocean, and at that point, they are able to tolerate salt water. But notice that their range of intolerance now includes fresh water. So if you take a mature salmon, the kind that has been living in the ocean, and you stick it in fresh water, it's going to die. Then later on, when they move back to the fresh water, they're going to need to shift their tolerance. Otherwise, they would move into fresher water and die. And so their tolerance goes back to similar to what it was when they were juveniles. And they undergo a lot of complex behaviors and body changes to allow them to do this. So please don't take baby salmon and stick them in the ocean. That's kind of mean. All right, this was a relatively short series of notes. Get ready for some more.